Welcome back to this week's episode of Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob McGuire. This morning, despite all the heat over the past couple of weeks, was actually pretty chill. I had to wear a hoodie heading out to work and whatnot. How's your day been so far with all the nice weather?
It was awesome. Like when I went to the gym this morning, it was like 65 degrees, and I was like, this feels like fall weather. And then I'm like, oh, wait, it's still July. There's going to be more heat to come. So it was a nice respite, I guess you could say, for all the heat we've had. But yeah, it's just nice. It's just nice.
It was a little bit of tease of football weather we'll have in the
Hmm.
next couple months. And sure enough, we have plenty of football to talk about. Today, some video clips from the HBO series that is following behind the scenes of the front office for the Giants, so Joe Schoen and crew. There was a conversation held at the Senior Bowl between some of the general managers, Joe Schoen, Brandon Beane, and ours truly, Dan Morgan. And it was very interesting. They started kind of discussing the parameters of a trade, that Brian Burns was available, and the joke of, hey, we want two first because we got two first offered. I mean, that was common knowledge. And obviously, since Burns had to get paid, he was asking for 30 plus million. There were negotiations that happened afterwards, but it was a very cool exchange to hear because that's very typical what you'll see in fantasy leagues when people are trying to trade either players or picks and get a leg up in their league.
Yeah, it's like the fantasy trade. I'm trying to help you, man. Like you need this more than me when it's really a bad deal for them. And I think it was funny too. He asked Brandon Bean, he's like, "Hey, you want to trade up to 6?" And Bean's like, "Yeah, but I can't afford it. We don't have anything." And so like it got me to think like if the Burns value had started or had stayed rather closer to those 2 ones, would we have been picking 6th overall? Maybe could we have gotten a Malik Neighbors or Roma Dunze, a Dallas Turner, even though he fell to 17. But who knows? There ended up getting a 2 and a 5, and with some more maneuvering, really, we ended up back in the first round at pick 32 for Leggett, and then we took the other 2 that we had and moved it to get the Rams 2 next year. And I believe we also swapped fifths with the Giants in this upcoming draft. So, or no, in this past draft we did,
Yep.
but we get their 5th this year, I believe is what it is. So a little all over the place. At the time, I'm sure we both expressed that we wanted more for Brian Burns. You know, he was 2-time Pro Bowler, one of our better players on defense, but it is what it is. And it's interesting to see how that kind of all started really back at the Senior Bowl, because you always hear reporters and other NFL people say, hey, these things are big for trades, for negotiations and things like that. The Senior Bowl, the Combine. And it's really cool to actually see how the idea of that trade was conceived between the Giants and the Panthers.
Yeah, and while we're kind of talking about some of these trades going forward, we get the Rams second next year. And so according to Veach win totals, when you kind of look at the probability of where the Rams are going to pick in next year's draft, they're probably going to pick middle of the first, middle of kind of each round. And so if we get their second, we're probably looking at, like, I want to say in the 40s, maybe early 50s in terms of where that pick's going to fall. And it's interesting because it's value you have to recoup, because part of the Bryce Young trade, we traded next year's second as part of that big mega deal. And I'll switch over to kind of like the Panthers probability, but is there anything that kind of sticks out to you between these two charts when you're looking at kind of the probability of where these teams are going to pick? And if there's anything that kind of jumps off the page to you?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that the Panthers are a worse team than the Rams, right? So we're going to be more favored to be picking earlier, as you can see our chart here, courtesy of you and some of the projects and stuff you've been doing, has a right skewed tail, which means most of our stuff is to the left. Got to be picking early as compared to the Rams. Like if we switch back, got to be more middle of the pack, right? I think it's safe to say that the Rams kind of overperformed last year based on what we thought and what betting markets thought in general. They lose Raheem Morris. They lose Aaron Donald to retirement. So their defense might take a bit of a hit. They lose a lot of the offensive coaching infrastructure they had as well to other teams. Zach Robinson, the new OC with the Falcons, and Liam Cohen, who bounced around there at Kentucky at the collegiate level, back to the Rams and stuff like that. He is in Tampa Bay now. So they're losing a bit on both ends of the ball. So it's not unreasonable to expect the Rams to regress a little bit from where they were last year. Obviously, they made the playoffs last year, lose to, I believe it was Detroit, right? Was the playoff loss they had. So around 15, 16, and again in the second round, that'd be right around 45 to 50, something like that, which it's less than ideal because you obviously want them to do worse so we get a higher pick, but it's better than nothing, which is what we had before with the huge Bryce Young trade. What you're talking about with that Scott Fitterer orchestrated. And it's funny, they said when that report came out that they were down to 3 players the Bears wanted: DJ Moore, Brian Burns, Derek Brown. And if we had included Brian Burns, how much different would the team look at this point? Because Bryce would have a weapon. Burns's value was certainly higher at that point, so we might still have our second in the upcoming draft. Hell, we might have had our first in this past year's draft. Who knows? But it's all in the past now. So hopefully, I hate to root against teams, but hopefully the Rams end up stinking a little bit, so we can get a better pick there. But yeah, it's looking like it's going to be a worse pick than where our pick originally would be, which is going to go to Chicago.
Yeah, so it's great that we're recouping value. The better we perform this year, like you said, the Rams, they lose Raheem Morris, Aaron Donald. There's possibility for regression. Matthew Stafford has an injury history. There are a couple injuries away, I would say, on the offensive line or some of their skill position players to being kind of like an average offense. And then if the defense isn't able to kind of perform, you really could see a slide from them, and that could open the door for us. That if we're kind of making I want to say division competitive push to win the NFC South, I could see us potentially kind of jumping them, kind of like what we saw this past year when the Texans jumped the first round pick that they in essence traded to the Cardinals this past year. So when they had the Browns first and their first, they traded their first, but because they advanced further in the playoffs than the Browns, they actually had a higher first round pick from the Deshaun Watson trade than they would have had with their pick. So,
and they actually beat the Browns too in that game. So either way, they win a playoff game, and they make the Browns lose, so they get a better pick. So it was really an interesting situation for them there. Maybe if we sneak into a division or a wild card round versus the Bears, maybe we can beat them or something to kind of do the reverse of what the Texans did last year.
Yeah, no, that'd be cool. Biggest thing is just finishing ahead of the Rams. That's the big push this year in terms of just draft value for next year. Around the NFL, pretty quiet. We're at that point where everybody's just kind of practicing, kind of going over things. The people that are holding out with contract disputes are stating kind of what they would like. And sure enough, CeeDee Lamb kind of comes out and says, hey, if I'm not getting paid $32 million, in essence, like I'm not a top 2 paid wide receiver in the NFL, I want to be traded. And I think that's a fair request. We talked about kind of like what his worth would be. And I think it is in that AJ Brown, $32 million a year, kind of what Brandon Ayuk is also looking for. And do you think the Cowboys are going to pay it? Do you think that they're able to get him to play on his current deal until next year? Like what ends up playing out here in Arlington?
Well, I definitely don't think they're going to pay him what he wants this summer. He's in the same scenario as Ayuk, right? Both in the same draft class, both first rounders, right? So they're going into year 4, into year 4. They have the 5th year after that, and then the tag. It's kind of like what we saw with T. Higgins, even though he was a second rounder. I think that's how it might end up playing out. Jerry Jones is stubborn, right? If they're not paying Dak, who is probably their most important player right now, if they're not paying Micah Parsons, who's their probably second most important player right now, I don't know if they're going to pay CeeDee. The Cowboys have a tendency in the past half decade or so to wait to pay their stars and then kind of pay the wrong people, like looking at Zeke, looking at Jalen Smith, looking at the corner they had. I think it was Byron Jones they had. Paid him. He was good the first year, but after that shipped him to Miami. So I don't know how that's going to play out.
Nasty back injury from
He
what I heard.
did, yeah. But on the first year of that deal, he was still really good. I'll say. But as far as the Cowboys go, I'm just not sure they get anything done, right? Like I said, Jerry Jones is stubborn, and they're kind of in an inflection point year, like what we've talked about with the coaches, the quarterback. Even when we talked about CeeDee, who I had as my number 2 receiver, and you had as number 3 going forward. So I definitely think he deserves what he is asking for. But as far as this year goes, this is a year where they have to either win a lot or they're going to have to tear it down. And I'm not sure, even though I think I would pay CeeDee because he's that good, I'm not sure the Cowboys view paying him as a smart thing to do if in the back of their mind they're thinking, hey, we might need to tear this down to the studs after this year. because we won't have a QB under contract, because we won't have a head coach under contract. So it's going to be really interesting. But I think a good warning sign if they decide not to pay CD is how the Panthers handled the Bryce Young thing. Even if they do bring in a new QB, you need a number one receiver. So there's no reason they shouldn't be paying him.
Yeah, no, like the Parsons and the CD contract, I don't think can wait. I don't think you should wait on those. The Dak one and the Mike McCarthy situation in terms of it also being his last year as a coach under contract, I can understand it. Like if it's not going to work with that coach and quarterback duo, ship them out. But when you have stars at premium positions and there's a going rate and you know that rate's only going to keep getting higher, pay the guy. Like, pay, because like you said, like what you saw with Bryce Young, what you saw even with Jared Goff when he went to the Rams, when there's no supporting cast for some of these premium quarterbacks that come in, and maybe they don't have the talent that just carry a barren roster. Like you got to have playmakers around them. And so I think that's something that has to be done. We'll see if it is. We've seen the Cowboys also add an influx of talent from the analytics department standpoint over the past year. So maybe you hope that they're able to go like, hey, from a numbers standpoint, you actually save money in the long run doing this deal now rather than playing hardball. And I think that's the issue with the Jones family, because that's who runs the Cowboys organization, is that family. Both, I think it's like sons and daughter are key like executives there. And it's they really need to understand that, hey, if we want to play in the modern NFL, we have to kind of play by the new rules. We can't do what we did in the 90s and the 2000s where like we're going to play hardball and we're going to win. That's just not how it works now. The top players get paid and they're going to get paid whether it's on your team or another team.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll say with CD is that with Micah Parsons, he is going to have to reset the edge rusher market or the D-line market. With CD, they have the luxury of having a guy who jumped the market so much in Jefferson that they don't have to set the market anymore. They can come in under his number and look like the good guys. And so when he's asking for 32, which is what AJ Brown just got this offseason, I think it was like the day or two after the draft. It was like really soon.
Well, you had the Devontae Smith extension, and so obviously AJ Brown's not happy with his old deal, and so that there was a restructure from there.
Right, but yeah, I agree there. And like, if that's what he's asking for, and you don't have to be like, oh, we're making him number one, then yeah, that's even more of a reason you should extend him. There's no looking like the bad guy unless you don't extend him, and it's kind of like what we're seeing with the Niners as well. The Ayuk saga has been going on for seems like since the middle of the season last year. And it's going to be interesting. Like we talked about, same thing happened with Debo a couple years ago when he was first team All-Pro, being the running back and receiver extraordinary weapon that he was. And he requested a trade and they paid him in the middle of the summer. We'll have to see with Ayuk, but again, the circumstance is a little different with Purdy. If they're going to pay Purdy, they're going to have to make room somewhere because they're already, I believe, over the cap for next year. So something's got to give.
Yeah. And like if Purdy is the quarterback moving forward, it's in that team's bench interest with John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan to honestly look at an extension next summer for Purdy, because that will be after year 3, that you only have one more deal on his rookie deal left. It's one of those things where he's going to have to get extended, and signing him earlier rather than later will also help them. So that kind of wraps it up for the Around the NFL. We were talking a little bit about some general managers, both with John Lynch there with the Purdy situation, the Jones situation with CeeDee Lamb, and that kind of correlates with the topic today. And we're going to talk about our top 10 general managers that if we were looking to build a team, that these are guys we would want leading the front office. What they've done. We'll talk about kind of draft records, trade records. We'll even kind of weigh in some of these contracts, whether or not they're able to extend guys early. I think that's one thing Howie Roseman does really, really well, that he's able to get these stars on cheaper deals. Like, I think when you look at, like, if you had to pay Jordan Mailata and Lane Johnson top of the line money, Devontae Smith, AJ Brown, that kind of money, you probably wouldn't be able to pay some of these other guys that help fill out your roster and are contributing starters. So I think every dollar counts here. And do you want to kick it off? I think the guy that we have at number 1 is the same, and rightfully so. I mean, they've won back-to-back Super Bowls.
Yeah, for sure. Just like last week, we both had Andy Reid number one. This week, we both have Brett Veach, general manager of the Kansas City Chiefs. It's hard not to put him there, right? Last week, I talked about how winning a Super Bowl is something that I value pretty highly. This week, it's the same thing, even though like the rest of the criteria might be a little different. But three Super Bowl rings started a brand new dynasty. It's hard to really talk about dynasties after following what happened for nearly 2 decades in New England. But I think the Chiefs are on their way to maybe not 2 decades, but at least a decade of dominance under Mahomes, Andy Reid, and what Brett Veach is able to do. Like if you look at their roster last year, even though the receivers weren't super good, like I think the depth was a bit lacking. Their defense I thought was excellent. Their offensive line excellent. They're like supporting Mahomes both with protection and the infrastructure on the other end of the ball, so that he doesn't have to score 30 or 40 points per game. And then if you look at what they did this offseason with the weaknesses that I talked about, poor receiver room. They had depth with Worthy and Hollywood Brown, two guys that can take the top off the defense. That's something they didn't have last year. Their downfield offense was almost non-existent unless Taylor Swift was in the crowd and Kelsey had to show out. So I think what he's doing in terms of drafting what they need now and possible future replacements, like you look at Kelsey, they draft Jared Wiley in the fourth round. He was the tight end from TCU. A lot of the film guys on Twitter were super high on him. Maybe he's your replacement. They draft Kingsley Suamatea, who might be their left tackle starter if Wanya Morris can't play. It's kind of like what we talk about with the Chiefs, like drafting a year early or something like that to replace those guys. Brett Veach is also really good at that, and I think we don't praise him enough for that. And then you just got to talk about how successful the team's been too, right? You mentioned it, two back-to-back Super Bowls with two similarly constructed, but I think differently viewed teams. Like the one from 2 years ago against the Eagles, that secondary was like all rookies, and they were able to get it done there. And then this year, the lack of receiver help and stuff like that. So really good work there. The only like recent blemish I would say on Veach's record is the Chris Jones steal last summer when he had the holdout, didn't play. I think it was 2 games, right? He didn't play. The first game they lose to Detroit on the season opener. I don't remember what happened the next week, but then they come back versus the Jags. Chris Jones is dominant, and they're roaring for the rest of the season.
Yeah, no. And what's interesting, and it was always the hesitation I had with Brett Veach. He was obviously in the Chiefs front office. He was hired internally. But the guy before him, John Dorsey, found a lot of superstars that kind of propelled this Chiefs team to a couple Super Bowls. John Dorsey was the guy that drafted Travis Kelce that we've been talking about. He drafted Tyreek Hill, who hasn't been a part of the past two Super Bowls, but was a part of a mega trade that allowed them to draft guys like Trent McDuffie and other playmakers that have impacted those Super Bowl runs. And they, in turn, didn't have to pay Hill all that money. Then they also, John Dorsey, drafted Chris Jones. So where Veach's record really starts, and they had been scouting him for a long time before drafting him, is Veach was the guy that drafted Patrick Mahomes. He's the guy that brought in the superstar quarterback. He's the one that signed him to a fantastic extension in terms of just value, in terms of getting a $500 million contract over 10 years when you know the quarterback market's going to well exceed 50 million. Now, will there be restructures and re-extensions? Absolutely. That contract is meant to be kind of molded over the next few years. But when you look at just how he's built the team, it's been absolutely phenomenal. And I think the two blemishes, you pointed out the Chris Jones contract this past year. It's like if you're going to pay him, you should have just paid him last year instead of giving him this kind of 1-year deal. The other is, I believe, drafting Clyde Edwards-Helaire in the first, where we talk about how he's been really good over the past couple of years, especially this past draft, of drafting guys that are going to replace starters in the next couple of years or vie for starting positions. That's something that I think he could have done a couple of years ago and would have helped the team. So I think as long as he's learning these lessons as he goes, and you have Patrick Mahomes as your quarterback and Andy Reid as your head coach, you're all going to be able to kind of make up for mistakes in essence. The margin for error isn't as small as it is for other teams when you have this trio kind of kicking things off, because I think over the past, when we do quarterbacks, head coach, and now general manager, the Chiefs own it, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I think the Clyde Edwards-Helaire thing might have been that they were just riding the high of the Super Bowl win, and it's like, all right, where do we need a spot starter, right? Because we're at pick 32, we're probably out of first round grades, so maybe Mahomes likes Clyde here, we'll take him. Obviously, didn't
But you
work
could
out
have gotten
super
a T
well. Right.
Higgins. Like
You
it's
could,
always like
right,
some of those,
right.
like you got to always get that guy, whether or not he's going to work out. If you get him and it doesn't pan out, then it's no different than Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But if you get him and it pans out, it's just the surplus from that is just exponential. And you want that on your team. So I think those were a lot of good points about Brett Veach. We have a couple differing opinions from here. And I like the route you went because I think this is a complete, like almost 180 of who Brett Veach is. The Chiefs ownership is known to be very frugal. They don't spend a lot of money. But this general manager that you have at 2, the owner kind of cuts him loose, allows him to do a lot of things that I don't think most general managers in the NFL are able to do because they're on a shorter leash.
Yeah, for sure. Number 2 for me, it kind of lines up with what I had last week. It's Mr. F them picks, Les Snead, right? And where we talked about how Veach has found maybe hidden gems or even drafted really well in the first round. Les Snead doesn't care about the first round. He kind of saw, I guess, a an arbitrage opportunity, so to speak, or a hole in the market where he's like, first round picks only work out X amount of the time. But that works out like all the time, barring injuries, like current superstars. And so he uses his firsts and goes and gets them. Got Jalen Ramsey, who was a big contributor to that defense when McVay was starting to take over. The offense was humming. Then that defense came along. Went out, got Stafford, results in a Super Bowl win for the Rams. So he's not afraid to trade picks. This is the first round pick he's had since Jared Goff, or since the team has had since Jared Goff, rather. And I think he's also really good at finding guys later in the draft, too. Talked about last week what McVay's able to do with guys like Kyren Williams, Puka Nacua. Les Need's the guy who found him, and he's able to do that with a lot of different people. Steve Avila, who he got in the second round. Granted, it's a second rounder. I think he's going to be one of the better centers in the league this year just based on his size. I also like how he's able to build the team with the lesser resources draft-wise. We talked about that defense last year. When we did our predictions pod, I'll say it every single time we're talking about the Rams. We were like, okay, it's Aaron Donald and who? A bunch of rookies. Well, Kobe Turner led rookies in sacks from a D tackle position. Byron Young, the 25-year-old edge rusher from Tennessee, had a really good year last year. So he's able to find guys. They're able to contribute. I wouldn't be surprised if the 2 Florida State guys they drafted in Verse and Braden Fiske, who played together for a year, I think they're going to be productive on that defensive line as well. And again, he's a Super Bowl winner in the Mahomes and Brady eras, kind of tangling there when Brady was ending and Mahomes was coming into his own. Nobody else has been able to do that. And so for me, that's why he's number 2. But I can see why you have some other people higher than him on your list.
Well, I want to give Les Snead his roses. He is on my top 10. He's at number 7 for me. When we look at, I'm working on a cool trade project of kind of seeing the surplus value gained from different trades. And when you look at the total surplus value gain from 2016 to 2024, Les Snead ranks 4th in all general managers. Guy at first is Brett Veach. He's number 1 on our boards. He does a lot of things right from a front office standpoint, but that's what Les Snead does well. He trades and he wins those trades. And like you said, when you're trading for proven commodities, that usually pays dividends. That consistency in terms of performance usually translates as long as there aren't injuries. And we saw that with the big guys that you talked about, Matthew Stafford, Jalen Ramsey, but you can also go back to guys like Brandon Cooks, or more recently when they traded for Von Miller on that Super Bowl push and sent a second-round pick. And so they are not afraid to move draft capital in order to get their guys to maximize a window. What I will say is because he has the ability to do this, he has the ability to pay guys. They've taken a lot of dead cap over the years. You look at the Todd Gurley contract, you look at the Jared Goff contract that they had to eat in that Matthew Stafford trade. They've had to kind of retool. We've seen Howie Roseman do this over in the Eagles, but some of those things I don't think would fly with other teams. And that is something that Les Snead has a luxury of in Los Angeles with that Rams ownership. And I think if he was in a different situation, we wouldn't see the results that we see currently. So it's one of those things I'm a little hesitant to put him this high. And the guy that I have is a guy that also is underneath an ownership that is known to be more frugal, isn't known to go out and spend a bunch, and that's the Buffalo Bills. And Brandon Beane and what he's done in Buffalo over the past half decade has been incredible. He comes to Buffalo with Sean McDermott. They're both from the Carolina Panthers staff. We joked about it kind of before the podcast days many, many years ago that Buffalo was turning into a Carolina 2.0. But what they did in terms of building that roster, immediately getting them in the playoff contention, and how they built it, that defense has been a top 10 defense for most of the time he's been there. They added Josh Allen. They've gone out and traded for Stephon Diggs. Granted, they sent Justin Jefferson in that trade in essence. But when you look at just kind of how he's built the roster and now how he's trying to follow Brett Veach's footsteps and doing kind of like a retooling of sorts without doing a full rebuild, it's really cool to see. I love how they've embraced 12 personnel with Dawson Knox, Dalton Kincaid. They have some bigger body guys that are just going to maul these smaller defensive packages that we're now seeing, and more nickel and dime. And I like it. I like what Brandon Beane's done. And if it weren't for Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid, and Brett Veach, I honestly think the Buffalo Bills would have a Super Bowl win over the past probably 4 or so years. It just seems like whenever they come and face them in the playoffs, they just don't have an answer to get over that hump. And maybe in the next year or two, we see something change on that front. But as of right now, that really seems to be the only thing holding back this Bills organization.
Yeah, I really like Brandon Beane, not just because he's a former Panther. I believe he was also the interim GM when Marty Herney was let go before Gettleman came in. So long ties to the Panthers. They completely transformed that organization when he and McDermott came over. They took on, I believe it was like a record number of dead cap, like 90 million or something, or maybe 75 million. Ridiculous number. They just said, all right, we're going to take all this. We're going to have to take our medicine, put it all in 1 year. We're not stretching it out, and we're eating it now so that when we move forward, everything's going to look better. Drafts Josh Allen. He knew that Josh Allen might be a project, waited a year or two on him. Now he's blossomed into one of the best QBs in the league. And like you said, consistently competitive. It's just they come up against Mahomes every year. And I think what he's been able to do in terms of, one, having a defense that has a lot of depth. He finds a lot of guys in late rounds with like corners, safeties, linebackers, and such, because the Bills tend to have a lot of defensive injuries, but they always have guys that can step in and fill those whenever they need to. I just think that all the guys that I have above them, kind of like similar to last week, they have a little bit more proven success in the postseason. And I do think that the general manager in the front office does contribute to that. So I have to weigh that a little bit here. But in terms of the other thing that I'm weighing, which is like roster construction, he's built one of the best rosters in football over the past few years. I think it's going to be interesting this year to see, like, with the perceived lack of infrastructure in terms of weapons around Josh Allen, how that's going to work out. Receivers, not weapons. But I'm interested to see how they're going to be this year. But he's number 6 for me, behind a bunch of Super Bowl winning GMs there. And yeah, it's just really good. He's kind of like how Les Snead is for you. He was 7 for you, 2 for me. Bean is 2 for you and 6 for me. But we both have the same number 3.
We do. And this guy, every time I look at the numbers don't necessarily support what we see. And what we have seen are 2 Super Bowl appearances, 1 Super Bowl win since 2017. And Howie Roseman has been able to completely rebuild teams over and over again. And it seems like he's always able to build a Super Bowl contender. He's always able to rack up draft picks. And he has pretty much this understanding with ownership that, like, hey, we know what we're doing. Give me some time. If something doesn't go right, we'll kind of like wipe the board clean and start again. And the fact that he's done this now with multiple coaches, worked with Andy Reid, finally got the reins from Andy Reid, had to work with a guy like Chip Kelly, brought in Doug Peterson, and then now is working with Nick Sirianni, and how he's able to kind of build these iterations of these rosters to contend in the NFC, to contend for Super Bowls, is almost second to none. And so that's why he's 3 for both of us. I'm a little skeptical of just terms of like, okay, how are you replacing a Hall of Famer in Jason Kelsey? What are you doing on the defensive side to kind of restock after all those injuries kind of made you a sieve at the end of the year, and where you started 10-1 to just fall down the stretch and lose to the Buccaneers in the wild card kind of round? Like, what are you doing to kind of fix that? And so I'm intrigued to see if the additions on the coaching staff, what they did through the draft, some of the extensions they paid the big money to their current players, if all that works out. And if it doesn't, then I could see him falling a little bit. But if they're right back in the Super Bowl mix this year, I could see him going up the spot 2 for both of us.
Yeah, so you said a lot of good things there. The 2 main things for me with Roseman and why he's this high. Number 1, he took that Super Bowl winning team that it had Nick Foles, right? But then they had Carson Wentz, who just got paid. That team went downhill pretty quick, and he was able to get out of it in basically 2 years and like restructure the quarterback, a lot of the receiving weapons, stuff like that. The defense, they were losing people, or not losing, but people on the defense were aging. I think they were able to do a lot there. And then number two, we talk about this all the time. He's like the master of extending players early, and there's virtually no downsides. Let's look at Devontae Smith, 25 million per year, maybe a little bit early for him. If he continues to ascend, it's a steal. If he stays the same, that's probably his value. If he gets worse, you can get rid of him earlier or trade them when they still have value on a better contract. He seems like he's the best in the league at this. And then when you look at stuff like what he did with Hurts and added 5 void years at the end, if they believe that he's the franchise quarterback, and I think they do, that's just setting up his next contract or his next extension. So I think he's really good contractually at making stuff work there. I think you brought up a good point with Mailata earlier, getting him early and Lane Johnson early there as well. I think it is going to be interesting to see how the team's going to work after Kelsey. Lane Johnson's also getting up there in age. Are the rookie first-round tackles going to be able to replace how impactful like a guy like Fletcher Cox was? It's going to be interesting there, but I do think if that defense held up a bit better down the stretch last year, we could have seen them back in the Super Bowl. And like you said, he could have been number 2 maybe for us on this list, but they did take a little bit of a step back, and I think this next year is going to determine our view of him moving forward, considering I think the Cowboys are also fighting for the division super hard, and this isn't the NFC of last year or last offseason rather, where we're like, okay, it's the Niners, Cowboys, Eagles, Lions. There are teams ascending now, so we're gonna have to see what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, we see week 1, it's going to be the Packers and Eagles. And this could definitely be like one of those like roads where like the Eagles keep kind of descending and the Packers are ascending. And I'm not saying that's what happens in week 1, but it's one of those things that can very much change the perspective of how this roster is constructed. Howie Roseman isn't known to necessarily hit on draft picks. When I kind of looked at weighted position surplus through the draft, Howie Roseman was a little below league average. Granted, he generated surplus over expectation on the plus side, but he's around guys like Mickey Loomis and Joe Schoen. And so where he kind of gains value is he's able to kind of trade back and gain draft capital that way. But when you're looking at who he's necessarily drafting, they haven't always panned out. We saw them take the 2 Georgia tackles in back-to-back drafts. And why I think Jalen Carter is a superstar, it's his counterpart, and I'm blanking out on the Georgia Stars
Jordan
name. Jordan Davis. I don't think he's nearly as good as Devontae Wyatt over in Green Bay. I mean, you've even made that point, but it's one of those things that you went for this, like pretty much like this outlier in terms of physical talent. Like there is very few people like Jordan Davis in terms of just size and physicality. But he offers you very limited snaps. And so if he's not on the field and he's not making plays, then it's like, okay, was that really worth the pick? We saw him take Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson. So evaluations still need to be improved on that side. But when we talk about contract extensions, when we talk about trading down, Howie Roseman is pretty much the guy that gets the gold star. He is one of the best, if not the best, at doing it. And I think he's always going to stay on the cutting edge. Like I remember listening to a Jason Fitzgerald podcast, and because he had built up a relationship with so many agents, there was at one point like an agent cut him a deal like, yo, if we can get a contract here, like we'll take less money. And it's because they know Howie Roseman is good to pay some of these guys. And at certain like crossroads, they aren't even going to argue with them. Where like when you have a guy like Jerry Jones and he wants to play hardball, he's not going to get a discount at some of those because he hasn't necessarily been player friendly. Like, hey, let me get you your bag. And so that relationship also helps. And that's not really talked about in something that can kind of be captured by numbers. These are stories you hear years after the fact and go, wow, that's really neat to kind of see that relationship between the two.
It's a good segue into your 4th GM that you have here. But I'm going to go first because we talked about both CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Ayuk and their related contractual troubles. And it fits perfectly because at number 4, I have John Lynch, the 49ers GM, and you have Jerry Jones. So on my end, John Lynch, this is also similar to last week how I had Shanahan above some Super Bowl winning coaches, whereas I have John Lynch here above some Super Bowl winning GMs. Number 1, they attacked that defensive line when he first got there. The Niners were kind of in a bad spot. They went through a couple of coaches there. The Jim Tomsula 1-year era was certainly an era of football all time, but he and Shanahan both come in. This is something that you'll see a lot with some of these high-ranking GMs and coach pairings. They come at the same time. So they come in. They attack that defensive line with multiple high draft picks. And eventually, John Lynch is able to find stars at all the important positions. He's able to trade for and capitalize really on a Trent Williams situation in Washington, which had just gone to hell there with him. He's able to bring him in. He finds George Kittle, I believe, in the 5th round. He's able to get Debo in round 2, Brandon Ayuk in round 1. He has stars at all the right spots now. The defense is still super strong. And this is despite losing coaches seemingly every year to being head coaching or having head coaching opportunities elsewhere. The talented roster remains, and I think the new coaches that come in are able to have similar success to their predecessors just because of the amount of talent that they have. If you look at their all-pro or the all-pro list this season, you look at this is just first team. Fullback was Juszczyk. Then you have McCaffrey, traded for McCaffrey, who was injury prone at the time, and I think have gotten good value out of them. Out of him, excuse me. Ayuk, George Kittle, Trent Williams. Then you have some second teamers there as well. He just 2 years ago, Talanoa Hufanga, as a rookie, was for All Pro. I think it was second team. So he's able to find guys in the draft, even though that he's had some higher picks there, and he's really sculpted a team that in the NFC, while the NFC was down for maybe 3 to 5 years there, it was still the class of the NFC. It was still able to go up against the best of the AFC. And I think that while the rest of the conference is catching up, that team's still super strong. And I think the number one thing that we have to point to is he's also was able to find Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant. And while the infrastructure around Purdy and the offense that Shanahan runs certainly helps him, I'm not trying to discount that. He's a capable quarterback, and you can't really say that you find too many capable quarterbacks as the last pick of the draft or as an undrafted free agent.
Yeah, you made a lot of great points. The things I'm going to say, I don't want to make it seem as a knock because he is in my top 10. He's at number 9. He's not as high for me. He doesn't crack the top 5, but he does crack the top 10. And for me, it goes back to where did he start when him and Kyle Shanahan came in? And if you look at 2017 to 2019, I believe if you add in, I don't think it's 2020. I think it's like the 2021 draft. They picked top 10 those first 3 years, and then they picked top 15 that other year. So he's had like higher draft picks earlier on to build this roster. So you have guys on rookie contracts still. Debo Samuel, yes, his second contract extension is starting to hit, but we just saw them have to cut Eric Armstead and go with a younger, maybe unproven guy and like a YGM. And so you have some of these guys where he's been able to fill the hole and has done it in free agency or these other avenues. They found Hargrave in free agency from the Eagles last year, and they do some of those cool things, but they've also had opportunities because they picked so high in the draft to get a guy like Nick Bosa, to get some of these playmakers that are going to make a difference. Why they have pulled the trigger on trading for a guy like Christian McCaffrey. The thing is if he ends up leaving or gets hurt in the next couple of years, do you have a guy that can play that kind of role? And I like the fact that they drafted the guy out of Louisville,
Garendo.
Isaac Garendo. Yeah, I was going to say something weird. So I'm glad you corrected me there. And I think he plays a very cool zone role. Could be like an Elijah Mitchell, a late round guy that's able to bust out 1,000, 1,500 yards if you need him to in a season on the ground. And so there's a lot to like about the process. But again, they've gone through a bunch of different quarterbacks. I still don't think Purdy is like this like top 10 quarterback in the league. And you wonder if that's going to be enough to get over the hump. And if some of these rookie contracts and now extensions start catching up to you, are you going to be able to keep this kind of super team together? And I think that's the big underlying question is, okay, we talked about it earlier in the episode. Purdy's going to get paid. If he gets paid, then what does the wide receiver room look like? The offensive line already kind of looks abysmal outside of Trent Williams. The defense, like I said, Eric Armstead leaves in free agency. Hargrave's getting older. You're hoping a guy like YGM can replace some of that production. And that for me is I'm not sure about the future, and that's why I have him lower. But yes, he's been to the Super Bowl. The guy I have at 4 actually has won a Super Bowl more recently than the 49ers franchise. And that is Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. And yes, why both of those organizations have not won Super Bowls since the 90s. The reason why I have Jerry Jones here is because they haven't necessarily picked at the top of the draft. When they have, I think they've done well in adding offensive line talent. Obviously, the Ezekiel Elliott pick, when you look back at not only the draft selection, but then the contract extension definitely bit him in the butt. but he's been a guy that's been able to go out and trade for a guy like Amari Cooper. And he's been able to draft guys like CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons. They were the team that found Dak Prescott. And I think when you talk about late round gems in terms of quarterbacks, Brock Purdy's in there, Dak Prescott's in there, Russell Wilson's in there. And so they've found that quarterback in essence in a later round. And they maximize kind of the rookie contract. And so there's a lot to love with, I think, the roster construction, both through the draft and trades, to like about this team. I think the biggest knock that comes against Jerry Jones, and we already talked about this earlier, is those contract extensions. If you aren't extending a guy like Jalen Smith and Ezekiel Elliott and letting those non-premium positions walk in free agency, if you're extending guys like Dak and Amari Cooper early, CeeDee Lamb and Micah Parsons early, you're probably saving some money to where you can keep a Super Bowl window open longer and keep adding talent like what we've seen the 49ers and Eagles do over the past couple of years. And that's something that they're limited in the past couple off seasons. And I think will hurt their chances to kind of make it to a Super Bowl in the next year or two. And so that's, I think, the biggest knock. But when you look at how the roster is constructed, how they've gone about it over the past half decade, 10 years, it's been phenomenal. I mean, you've even said it yourself. That offensive line that they constructed in the 2010s was one of the best of all time. And that comes from the standpoint that they drafted those guys. They had those evaluations. Tyler Smith has looked like a hit. And I don't think Tyler Smith was on a lot of people's radars. Granted, he was a first-round pick, so that's wrong to say that. But in terms of being a guy that could take that next step, I think there were like 4 other tackles taken before him. And I think you could argue Tyler Smith might be better than several of them.
Yeah, for sure. In that particular draft, I remember watching Tyler Smith, and he had, I think it was maybe the SMU game. I don't remember. He had a game where he had like 7 holding penalties, and I was like, probably better as a guard. I wrote that at the end of my notes. And what do you know? He's probably the best left guard in football now. Just really excellent there. But I can't deny how good their roster has been built the past half decade or so. I don't have Jerry Jones on my list. I have Stephen Jones on my list because I genuinely think he makes all the good decisions there. I'm not a believer in Jerry. Even though he might run the show, he might not make like some of the more shrewd decisions. And all of the upfront bad stuff you see associated with him. The Zeke deal, the Jalen Smith deal, not paying their stars now. So I do have the Cowboys, I'll say de facto general manager on my list. He's number 10, kind of similar to how John Lynch is number 9 for you, whereas he's number 4 for me. But yeah, that roster construction is excellent. I will say throughout the maybe late 2000s to early 2010s, they were like the middling Cowboys, as the 8-8 Cowboys and stuff like that. So they really haven't tasted the true success that they had back in the mid 90s after the Panthers ended their dynasty. They haven't really recaptured that until maybe the past couple years, where 12-5 every year, some playoff success. I think 1 playoff win there, they got bounced in the other ones. But I think for me to have him higher, he's going to have to do some of the stuff that Howie Roseman's able to do, extending early. He's going to have to win in the modern era like Veach and Les Snead. Like John Lynch, even though he's picked high, I'm not going to count against him for coming into a bad situation. And then John Lynch also missed on Trey Lance, but the team is still the best in the NFC, regardless of that. And that's the team that he's built around that. I think I have to see a team as competitive as the Niners, like the NFC favorite every year. They were favored in every single game last year. And I think their preseason opening is that they're still favored in every single game this upcoming year. Like before the season, obviously injuries can change that. I think I need to see the Cowboys rise to that height in recent time for me to put Jerry Jones or Stephen Jones that high. But there's no denying that the man is probably the best marketer in the history of our league. He had great success back in the early 90s, early to mid 90s and stuff like that. But
when we talk about the salary cap, because we are talking about general managers, and this is definitely a side tangent, Jerry Jones was hugely influential in some of the TV deals that kind of set up the kind of money and landscape, because we could have gone in a direction similar to the NBA or one of these where the salary cap's built a little bit different, the revenue streams are a little bit different, and he was able to go in and negotiate with CBS and Fox and get these bigger contracts that have turned into the monster it is in terms of, and for anybody that buys the NFL packages, you kind of know kind of these two-headed beast where it's great when you get the content, not so great when it doesn't work. So definitely side tangents, but yes, he has been, I think, influential from a marketing standpoint, from the NFL as a historical standpoint, and moving it into the modern era that we have today. And I think that's exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely one of the most important people in the history of the NFL. I don't want to take that away from him. But when I'm making this list, and it's for, if you remember our criteria, it's the next two seasons. We want this general manager, front office structure, what have you, just based on them not paying the stars. And I think that team is on a bit of a downward trajectory, excuse me. And he's a big part of that. I just can't have him be that high, despite how successful he was when he entered the league early and I guess middling success during the 2000s and 2010s and stuff like that. But excuse me, for me, he and his son are definitely on the list, just not as high for me. And then I guess we're both through our top four there. Number
We have
five,
Super Bowl winners at 5. So who do you have?
yeah. So this guy's not on your list, and to me, I'm a bit surprised by that because I think what he was able to do to this franchise, with like maybe one singular move and some preceding that, is one of the more important things that's happened in the last 10 years, let's say in the NFL. And I have Jason Licht, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers GM. If we recall back when Jameis Winston was drafted, it was Winston Mariota. They actually played week one that, or not week one that year, but they played against each other that year. That's neither here nor there. But the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were kind of the laughing stock of our division and of the NFC as a whole, right? They like topped out at 7-9. They were always the little brother to the Cam Panthers, to the Matt Ryan Falcons, to the Drew Brees Saints. They were just always in the basement, never really competitive. They had one, I think, 8-8 year. I think that was the Jameis 30 for 30 year, and then still regressed again. But he sneakily started drafting important people. He added Vita Vea. He kind of retooled that defensive line, bringing in Shaq Barrett from the Denver Broncos, who had experienced a Super Bowl win before. He like sneakily built up a good team, or like an all right team on the surface, because Jameis was still the QB, or Jameis and Ryan Fitzpatrick. And then he's like, oh, Tom Brady's leaving the Patriots. Let me lure him here. You know, it's Florida. You can have a little bit less in taxes to pay. And look, we built a good offensive line for you with Tristan Wirfs, who's a younger guy. Donovan Smith was still a good left tackle there. They had some of the interior pieces that are in Cincinnati now that were still pretty good at the time. And it's like, if I can get a quarterback here, we can really make a run at this. And not only did he get a quarterback, he convinced Tom Brady to come play for him. And the result was they beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, who had just come off of a Super Bowl, and they just absolutely decimated him. And I think that, number one, him being able to do that. Number two, post the Brady retirement and the Bruce Arians kind of odd retirement. I don't really remember how that went down, but it was like a soft firing kind of, because he didn't mesh with Tom Brady, if I recall that correctly. After all that, the team still made the playoffs with guys like Baker
At 8 and
Mayfield.
9.
At
Well, 9-8 this
hey,
past year, but
9-8. Well, 8-9, they made it with Brady. And then 9-8 with Baker Mayfield, of all people, a guy who was a castaway from his original team. We traded for, we cut him, and then he played like 3 games for maybe more than that, for the Rams. Or one of the games he had was spectacular. It was on Christmas Eve, or maybe on Christmas. I remember winning a fantasy football game because of that, because my opponent had the Broncos defense and the Rams scored like 50. So shout out Baker for that game. But still, the team's still trucking along. He's had some really good draft hits in the past couple of years. Antoine Winfield Jr. might be the best safety in the league. Vita Vea is really good. Tristan Wirfs has been a very versatile piece, both at right and left tackle. So he's had some really good success there. He's able to keep Mike Evans and other stars home this offseason, despite losing basically their entire offensive coaching staff to Carolina. So I really like what Jason Light's been able to do. I think the fact that Brady came there kind of underrates how he built the team and how successful the team, or not successful, but competitive the team has still been able to be post that Super Bowl run. But I think he deserves a lot of credit for that.
This is where we get into murky waters. And the reason why Jason Licht, he's not in my top 10, he's not in my honorable mentions. I think he got lucky with the situation he was put in, because they don't draft Tristan Wirfs until they sign Tom Brady. The pieces, the infrastructure they had on kind of both sides, they had a couple nice pieces, but a lot of teams have a couple nice pieces. I would compare it almost to like the Packers situation that we just saw like last year. They have a question at quarterback. Jordan loves the guy, and then all of a sudden Brady becomes available through free agency. They had plenty of good pieces on the offense. They had a couple pieces on defense. You have a small window. You maximize that by kind of spending to your limits and building a super team. We've seen the Rams do it with Les Snead just trading for guys. We've seen it in the case of Jason Licht when they got Tom Brady. They go out, they get Donovan Smith. They retain some other guys. They go out on, I believe, on defense and pay a couple of their dudes. And like when you look at just how it was conceived, there are a couple rosters I would say now are primed to make a push if they had a quarterback. And I always feel like every couple of years you have those circumstances. And I think they got lucky that Brady fell into their lap because Brady is a Hall of Fame quarterback. He's the greatest to ever do it from that position at this time. And it's one of those things that if he's not the quarterback, I don't know if they win a Super Bowl. And if you look at the rest of his record, they've won 10 plus games in 2 years. Those 2 years were with Tom Brady. Outside of that, they don't win because exactly like you said at the top of the segment, they are the laughing stock of the NFC. Like this was a team prior to that was going back and forth between Ryan Fitzpatrick and Jameis Winston at quarterback. And right now, yes, they do have Baker Mayfield. He looked good last year when they went 9-8, but again, they didn't win 10 games. I don't think they're a 10-win team this year, even though they have, like you said, guys like Antonio Winfield, Mike Evans. They have Tristan Wirfs. They have Vita Vea. They have some of these pieces that could really kind of impact the game. I just don't see it as a stacked powerhouse like the teams that we've talked about, like the 49ers, the Eagles, the Cowboys, even the Chiefs, the crown of the NFL. And so that's why I don't want to necessarily give him credit for the Brady, because like if Tom Brady doesn't come to Tampa Bay, they don't sign a guy like Antonio Brown on their Super Bowl run. And to have Antonio Brown as your wide receiver 3, yes, was cheat codes back then, back in 2020. Like that's just how it is. We're going to call it what it is. And like, I don't know if you can really argue that, but those are just my counterpoints. Like I think he's a decent GM, but when you look at like draft wise, his weighted position surplus, yes, he's above average. He's at number 12 in that. When you look at his win rate in terms of trades, he's league average at 15. When you look at the net surplus value gained through trades, this is a guy that ranks towards the bottom at 19th currently in the league. So when I'm looking at all these numbers and I'm just seeing that he's like average, I don't see the top 10 GM that you're top 5 in this case pegging him as.
Well, and I don't want to take away from any of those numbers or metrics. They're obviously they tell a good story, but I don't think any of that matters when number one, you win the Super Bowl. And it's not that Brady just fell in their laps. Brady had other suitors. There were multiple other teams. The Niners were looking at him. I remember that was a huge story, was him going to the Niners, because didn't he grow up as a Niners fan?
And if the Niners had gotten him, I think they win a Super Bowl. Do the Bucs win a Super Bowl if they don't get Tom Brady?
It's if they got him. Jason Licht and their team got him. They went out and got him. They were the ones to lure him to Tampa. And from there, they built the super team around him. They bring in, and Ndamukong Suh was one of the guys that you talk about. They signed Gronk, who had retired. Because
exactly. He came out of retirement. Well, Antonio Brown.
I think all of this stuff happened, but you have to give credit to the guy who made it happen. And it was Licht going out and getting Brady. And then I agree, they were the laughing stock of our division before that, but post Tom Brady, they're still competitive. They're the number 1 team in the division. We thought that they'd be last in the division last year without Tom Brady, and they win it. So they're able to continue their success in winning the division and making it to the playoffs. And I don't see them taking a huge step back anytime soon. And the fact that you're able to basically pull all of that out of thin air and create a Super Bowl run like that and continue to have your team in the playoffs, that to me means something. And as this is the next 2 years going forward, this is a guy that, as we have seen, show that he can just make a team happen like that. He can, let's say, I don't know, next year, a guy like Dak. Let's say Dak becomes available and like they do some weird sign and trade with Baker to the Cowboys because Cowboys need a quarterback, and they get Dak and they're like, all right, we have Dak now. Let's add one more O-line piece. Let's add this and that. Maybe they make an NFC championship run and stuff like that. Are we going to give credit to Dak for just being a free agent and making them the better team? Or are we going to give credit to the guy who signed him? Like,
so how many times does a guy, and I'm being completely like just transparent with this, a guy like Tom Brady become available? So Peyton Manning did
Zero.
a couple years back.
Well, yeah, Peyton Manning.
Did because he became a free agent. They draft Andrew Luck. They weren't sure about his neck injury. He had, I think, two really main suitors. It was like the Titans and the Broncos.
You could call Brett Favre, maybe.
Yeah, and
Like,
Aaron Rodgers was traded, but it's like, again, these type of quarterbacks don't really ever become available. So yes, Jason Licht deserves his roses when it comes to going out and getting Brady, being the guy that says, hey, no, you're going to be in Tampa. And it helps that you're in Florida. Like you said, the lower taxes, beautiful weather. There's a lot of things going for you on that front. But again, I think it was more just, if you even go back a couple of years, like Tampa Bay, like the year they draft Jameis Winston, they had Mike Evans. They had a couple other pieces. Maybe they used the number one pick to add more talent that way. I don't see Tom Brady going to that rendition of the Bucs. And at that point, Jason Licht had been the general manager like 3 years. So again, I think it was right time, right place. And yes, he did his part to reel him in.
Well, I guess my last question is, if the team was that bad before, right, before Brady, why would Brady want to go to said team? Is my
Exactly.
question.
But it has to be a contender. It has to be a team.
Yeah, he turned it into a contender. Like you said, they sign him, then they draft Tristan Wirfs, then they add Gronk, then they add Antonio Brown. So it's like, not only did he go out and get Brady and then add these pieces, he also had infrastructure in place beforehand in guys like Vita Vea, Mike Evans, and some other guys like Chris Godwin as well, even though he was a little bit oft injured early in his career. But I think that's enough talking about Jason Licht. We've been on here for like 15 minutes. You have a different guy at 5 who I have at 7, so pretty close there. And I had Bean at 6. So so far, we're kind of even keeled, but the next guy you have is closer.
So the guy that I have has done a lot of polarizing things. I don't know if his draft process, kind of like in the mid 2010s, was all that great. But when you have an owner that's willing to be patient, that's happy that you brought a Super Bowl title to the city, there's usually a little bit more luxury and leniency in terms of what you're able to do and what you're able to try. And that's John Schneider. This is a guy that came in kind of around the same time as Pete Carroll, and they were able to rebuild that team. They go out, they trade for Marshawn Lynch, their enforcer in the run game. They draft guys like Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas. They hit on late round guys like Russell Wilson and Richard Sherman. They had true dogs like a Doug Baldwin at certain positions. I think they ended up, I don't know if it was signed through free agency or I think it was a trade with the Buccaneers, but they go out, they get Michael Bennett. They build a Super Bowl roster. They build the LOB. They go the back-to-back Super Bowls. And they almost win back-to-back Super Bowls outside of that goal line call with Russell Wilson against the Patriots and Tom Brady. And so when you look at just how he was able to build a championship team, how he was able to do it mainly through the draft and adding a couple pieces that kind of just put the finishing touches on, that was really cool to see. And then what we've seen over the past, like I want to say half decade, is he's been able to rebuild that offense. I mean, he's added guys like, I would say their wide receiver room now is better than it was on that Super Bowl run. You have guys like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. You just draft Jackson Smith and Jigba out of Ohio State last year. They have a decent tight end room. I know a lot of them left in free agency. But the offensive line, they've been able to rebuild through the draft. The defense, despite poor trades with Jamal Adams, he's been able to offset that with trades like the Russell Wilson deal to Denver and recouping value that way. So while there are a lot of polarizing things he has done that has been bad in terms of reaching for guys in the draft or making a bad trade here and there, he seems to offset it and have his head on his shoulders. He's a guy that Dan Morgan and Dave Canales have probably learned from in their time in Seattle in terms of building a roster, in terms of building a playoff team. And he's just done it for so long at this point that it's hard to knock him. I know I use some of the metrics to knock Jason Licht. John Schneider ranks 14th, so 2 spots below, and kind of the surplus over expected when we look at weighted position surplus. And then when you look at just his ability to trade, and this is where I think his value comes in, he ranks 3rd in the surplus value gained behind Brett Veach and Chris Ballard. So ahead of Les Snead, who you had really high. And then when you look at it from like a win rate standpoint, this is a guy that has won a decent amount of trades. I'm trying to find his win percentage right here. He is at 4th at almost a 62% win rate. So again, this is a guy that he knows what he's doing. He's built the team the right way. And it's hard to find things to knock him for outside of a few things that happened about 10 years ago when they were coming off some of those Super Bowl highs and feeling like they could just draft projects and they would become starters.
Yeah, for sure. If we had done this ranking maybe, like you said, 10 years ago, it'd be hard to keep him out of number one or number two. What he did those 2 years when he built the Legion of Boom, got Russell Wilson. They ended up trading for Marshawn Lynch as well. Like he really constructed a super strong team that ruled the NFC for what, probably 3-ish, 4 years, right when we were coming up, right when other teams were coming up. So really good GM there. I like his drafting then. I like his drafting the past 2 or 3 years. There's just a big gap in the middle where some of the picks were just incredibly questionable, and not just even in the first round. Like I think back a couple of years ago when they drafted, it was Dwayne Eskridge over Amon-Ra St. Brown, stuff like that in the second round. A lot of teams passed on Amon-Ra, but still, like the span of like LJ Collier, the linebacker that they got, I can't even. It was Jordan Brooks, I think is who it was. It was just like a 4-year span there of just. I don't know what these picks are. These guys are like 50th, 60th on consensus board, and they're taking them. I guess maybe it's because they were so good and they could afford to do stuff there. I don't know, but my thing with John Schneider is he's obviously been successful in the past. I think he's like rebuilding a really strong contending team now. I think they're only a couple spots away from being one of the classes of the NFC. I love Geno, but like I'm not sure he's the guy that can push them into a conversation with the Niners, with the Lions, with the
But they have a
Packers, maybe
capable
ascending.
backup in Sam Howell. I like the fact that John Schneider was a part of the hiring process and Mike McDonald. I think they
I
realized
do
the
like that.
defense needed to be overturned. And it's stuff like that, exactly like you said. Had we done this 10 years ago coming off the Super Bowls, he's probably top 3. I think in this point, in that 5 to 7 range, until we see some of these things play out, we aren't sure if he's top 5 again. But I think that span in the middle is really what's killing him.
Yeah, for sure. Like we were talking about, if he didn't, and it wasn't just him, it was Pete Carroll and it was everybody. Russ, he was still good, but he was regressing a little bit. Like they only had Tyler Lockett for a while. The run game was just abysmal for a few years when they had like Christine Michael, Chris Carson was always hurt, stuff like that. So they didn't really have the depth over that little span there. I want to say what, like 2016 to 2019, 2020, like that kind of time frame there. But I really like what he's done recently. And like we said, maybe if this is even a year in the future, like when we do this next year, if they take that next step, he'll be up a bit higher for me. But for me, number 7 is where he caps out, below a lot of Super Bowl winners and guys like John Lynch, who turned his team into the best in the NFC, and Brandon Beane, who turned his team into maybe the best non-Mahomes team in the AFC. So he's right there for me.
Okay. So you already kind of alluded to this. John Schneider's at 7. At number 6 is Brandon Beane. I had Brandon Beane at 2. Something that we hadn't talked about, the surplus over expected, kind of factoring in the weighted position surplus with drafting. Brandon Beane was league lead in that. But a guy that's underrated in the top 10 in drafting, I think he's a top 5 in terms of trades he's made, and that's Chris Ballard. And when we talk about guys, and I brought this up when I talked about Veach, when I talked about Beane, is that they don't have necessarily the bankroll that some of these other general managers have to work with. And so he works with a very cheap owner, and that's just how it is in Indianapolis. Their ownership, Jim Irsay, is just it's questionable. The guy kind of inherited the team from his dad, and he's a little spoiled brat that's 60, 70 something years old.
He's a bit eccentric.
Yeah, he's out there. And regardless of all that, Chris Ballard has been able to navigate all the Andrew Luck injuries, Andrew Luck's retirement. Initially with Frank Reich, they're able to make guys like Jacoby Brissett and Phillip Rivers work, make kind of these wild card pushes. I think what he's done with Shane Steichen over the past 2 years has been very impressive. I was honestly like really surprised of how they've rebuilt kind of the offense so quickly from what we saw with Frank Reich 2 years ago, between the offensive line getting healthy, between them drafting a guy like Adonai Mitchell and Anthony Richardson. The defense, I think there are a couple question marks, but when you're able to trade for guys like Eric Armstead, you have a guy like Kenny Moore in the secondary, you have some pieces to kind of work around and build. If they can kind of revamp the defense, I think in the next couple years, both through free agency and the draft, this is a team that can not only contend in the AFC South, because they were on the fringe and just being a wild card team and winning that division right at the end of last year, to being a contender in the AFC. we talk about all these young quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. They're on their second extensions. Like they're on those contracts where they're approaching 30, if not already kind of at that doorstep. And so they're kind of becoming the veterans of the league. And so when we talk about young superstars, Richardson has that if he can stay healthy. And I think that's his big thing is Shane Steichen with the weapons at his disposal, with some of the concepts he's going to have and the threat he is as a runner. I mean, this is a guy that we could be talking about as like a top 10, top 15 quarterback in the next year or two. And that could propel them to being a Super Bowl contender, because we've talked about having a quarterback on a rookie deal and being able to build around him. That's what's allowed CJ Stroud to kind of thrive in Houston and allowed the Texans and Nick Caserio to kind of build the roster around him that way. So Chris Ballard, I think, is on a limited budget. And regardless of that, I think he is putting the Colts in a position not only to win, but win big. And so we'll see if it plays out. But I think what he's done in Indianapolis in terms of just like the marginal addition you can do as a GM, given what you have on the table, he's done phenomenally.
So for me, Chris Ballard did not make my list or my honorable mentions. He's like my Jason Light for you. I think we tend to forget that before the Steichen hire, Chris Ballard was on the hot seat for like 2 or 3 years. And I'll attribute some of that to Frank Reich's like stale scheme, some of the quarterback woes that they had to endure, even though, like you said, with Brissett, with Phillip Rivers, I think the offense was humming. Carson Wentz was all right. I'll say it was all right. Shout out the Jags game at the end of the year with Carson Wentz that year. And then with Matt Ryan. So like the last 2 years were like that. But what I will say is, while I do appreciate the trade for DeForest Buckner a couple of years ago with the Niners, outside of that and outside of Quentin Nelson, the guard that they drafted, their first round picks, I draw a blank trying to remember what the hits were from a stretch of Quentin Nelson and Anthony Richardson, like in between there. I do like Richardson. Obviously, we're not really sure what he can do with a full season yet. I thought he was phenomenal in the games he did have, though. I really think the hiring of Steichen has saved the public perception of Chris Ballard, because back-to-back, maybe even 3 years before that, it was kind of all right, we got to go get this guy to save my job, get a new quarterback, got to get this guy. And like I said, I do think some of that was Frank Reich's fault. It's odd how their O-line magically got better when Frank Reich left, even though it was like all the same people. So maybe a lot of that was on Reich. We saw how stale and stagnant the offense got here when Reich took the reins. But I'm just not big on what Chris Ballard did. It's kind of like with John Schneider. I think I liked him early, and then there's a stretch there where not a huge fan. But recently with Steichen, and granted it's a 1 year sample size, but I think it's trending up, and he might have saved himself there. But before that, I do remember the times of, okay, it might be time for them to move on, new GM and new head coach, draft a new quarterback high, stuff like that. But I do like the recent stuff. I'll say that.
So Quentin Nelson, because you brought up kind of like the disparity between that and some of their first round picks and how they hit. So 2019, right afterwards, they didn't have a first round pick. I don't know. I don't think that was for the trade. It might have been the Buckner trade. They got Rock Ya-Sin, a cornerback, really hasn't panned out since being drafted. Year after in 2020, I don't know if this was for Carson Wentz.
Yeah, it was, because it was conditional. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It was
and then
because it was conditional, I remember.
Gotcha. So in 2020, though, why they didn't have a first round pick, their 2 second round picks, Michael Pittman and Jonathan Taylor. 2021, their first round pick, Kwity Paye. He's a decent edge. Didn't have a first in 2022, dropped Alec Pierce and then Jelani Woods. And then last year was, technically like 2 drafts ago, they drafted Anthony Richardson, and this past year, Laitu Latu. I feel like if Laitu Latu and Kwity Paye can be a good duo, and you have Buckner in the middle, you have some of that kind of just push from the defensive line, I don't have a lot of question marks about the offense. And that's what I'm more saying about like Chris Ballard and how he's been able to construct this, is they were able to roll out an offense that could at least produce with kind of average, kind of just these journeyman quarterbacks. And so I'm impressed by that in terms of you have a limited budget. You aren't able to go out and spend big in free agency, and you're able to still kind of put out a 500 plus roster and make these wild cards and be on the kind of doorstep to where if you get a franchise changing quarterback in Anthony Richardson, that's going to be the difference maker. And so I think that will be kind of the determinant if he goes any higher. Maybe he falls off the list. Like if that wasn't the guy and we see a guy like Will Levis do a lot better in Tennessee, then that goes back to just poor evaluation on their front and not taking the right guy at number 4.
That's fair. I think the last thing I'll say is with the names that you read off there for the first round picks following Nelson, it's kind of like some are boomer bust, like Richardson. I think he has all the talent in the world, but pretty significant injury history, even leaking into his pro career. The same with Latu, the medical retirement back at Washington. And now he's also an older prospect. Granted, if he stays on the field, he's probably the best defender in the class, like if he can sustain it. So we'll have to see there. But like I said, I really think the Steichen hire has galvanized that team. And I do think if they can do a little bit more on defense, maybe my opinion would change as well, because you don't think of a lot of names on that Colts defense, even though like it hasn't been a horrible unit. I just think that it's middling, and it might be holding some of the
bend don't break with Gus Bradley and all that. So yeah, I get
and
that.
with the plethora of quarterbacks that they've had, if the defense maybe were a bit stronger, maybe the Frank Reich era would be looked upon more favorably toward the end there when he had to shovel like Wentz and like 40-year-old Matt Ryan out there.
So, yeah, and I definitely think that there needs to be talent on that side. I just think you can address that if you hit on quarterback and you see that, hey, the guy that we took at 4 is that cornerstone piece. Then the owner will be like, okay, let's go trade and sign for this defender, or we can pay this guy in free agency, or let's move up in the draft and get our guy. I'm not saying those are always the best or smart moves to make in the NFL. But when you have a window like that, it gives you kind of an incentive to go out and add talent via those forms. And so we'll see if that's the case. Again, he could rise or fall based on this. But at number 6, that's who I have. I already talked about how I had Les Snead at 7 earlier on this. You had him at 2. At number 8, we introduced 2 new guys that neither of us had at this point. Your guy at number 8 does make my honorable mentions list. And then the guy that I have at 8 is your number 9. So we'll start with your number 8, and then we'll get into my number 8, your number
9. For sure. Number 8 for me. And from this point on, the last 2 guys aren't as accomplished as everybody else on my list, just because that's the nature of the business, right? Not everybody can be a Super Bowl winner and stuff like that. But at number 8, I have Brad Holmes. And he's really, I talked about this with Dan Campbell last week, who I believe I had him at 7. But Brad Holmes has turned the Lions, a team that hadn't won a playoff game in 30 or so years, into, if not the class of the NFC, maybe the second best, third best team. And we did this when we ranked our like NFC and AFC tiers last year. I thought that the Lions were, I think, the third or fourth best team in the conference, and they delivered. He's been able to do it with a quarterback that isn't the most talented, that he had to recoup. It was basically a throw-in with the Stafford deal at the time, because they had to include the 2 picks because of the Goff deal, the dead cap they had to eat and all that. But he's really built a team around that. He hired Dan Campbell, who I think is an excellent floor raiser in terms of getting the most out of his players. I think despite some of the, we'll call them non-premium draft picks early, I'm talking Jahmyr Gibbs, I'm talking Jack Campbell, Laporta, and Brian Branch even. Some of those players last year, speaking of like Laporta, he could have been a contention for Offensive Rookie of the Year if we didn't have Stroud have a historic season or Nakua be an All-Pro. But you got to look at what Laporta was able to do. Some of the best tight end seasons one of the best tight end seasons we've ever seen, and it was from a rookie. We got to look at Brian Branch. He was in contention for Defensive Rookie of the Year, despite being drafted as a star or a safety. They're able to use him at corner in some instances. Jahmyr Gibbs, once like game 8 or 9, once that shift kind of happened during the second Montgomery kind of injury spell there, he really, really took off and was significant for their playoff push. Jameson Williams, when he's been on the field, it's been hit or miss, but in the game against the Niners, he had those really cool touchdowns. Or the really cool end around touchdown play there. So I really think that despite not doing the conventional thing per se, he's still been able to add good and good infrastructural and good high upside talent to an offense that features Ben Johnson, where he can move all these pieces around. I think bringing the Lions out of that funk where it really was the Packers, the Bears. The Bears were decent under the Nagy era, where they had that strong defense, and the Vikings with Kirk Cousins. It was the Lions in the dumpster, kind of like the Buccaneers. But now it's kind of similar to the Buccaneers. They're at the top of the division, but it's not, hey, it's a 9-8 division win. It's, hey, we're going to win 12 games and win the division. This year we might win 13. And I really think that taking them from those depths to the heights that they are now, and it's truly sustainable, I think, especially with them being able to retain Ben Johnson for 2 straight off seasons. I think their roster and their success is sustainable. And that's why I have them at 8.
I think you made a lot of good points. He is on my honorables mentions list. And for me, Brad Holmes, his process is poor. And I'll get to that in a second. The evaluations in terms of hitting on guys that are football players, which that's what his comment. Like, we draft football players. We aren't drafting X position. And you can take away from those statements what you want. And I'll get into that a little bit in a second. But for me, it's this, that he is opening himself a window that if these guys, these rookies that he drafted with these high picks are able to pan out, you're going to have that 2-3 year window, which I think was similar very much to the Tampa Bay Bucks that we just talked about. You have a good situation. You have a veteran quarterback. You, like you said, you retain your coordinators this year. You arguably have one of the best offensive coordinators who isn't a head coach in Ben Johnson in terms of a play caller and just play designer. And so there's a lot to love. But most teams that go to the Super Bowl and win it, that don't have Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady as their quarterback, they have rookie quarterbacks on those rookie contracts, or quarterbacks on rookie contracts. There we go. Slipping over my words there. But because of that, they're able to add an influx of talent. And it's those kind of teams that are recognizing, okay, we need those edges. I didn't see that. They had those top picks. They didn't take one of the top quarterbacks last year. They choose to extend Jared Goff this year. It's one of those things that if that doesn't pan out, if he's not a guy that can get you over the hump, then you're just going to keep hitting this wall where you're a contender in the NFC until the roster is kind of devoid of talent, or you have to retool and rebuild. And that, for me, is the biggest hesitation with Brad Holmes. I think his just negligence of understanding there's surplus to be gained in taking premium positions. There's value in trying to move up for a quarterback that you can get on a rookie deal. Those kind of levers and strings that you can pull, he didn't take advantage of. And I think we could be talking about a better Lions team almost had he taken process into account with the evaluations him and the scouting department were making. So he definitely comes from the Les Snead background. He was the director of scouting personnel for Les Snead, and his drafting tendencies, if you look at just the positions they take within the first top 100 picks, those first 3 rounds, is very similar. Him and Les Snead have a very similar drafting process. And if Brad Holmes adopts the idea of, okay, I can't add premium, or I don't feel comfortable taking premium positions with these top picks, I'm going to use these picks and go trade for some of these top players. I think that's where we can see a shift. And I talked about a couple weeks ago, what if they move Jamison Williams and like a future first for Brandon Ayuk? And now you have Brandon Ayuk and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And that you can work with. You have 2 superstar receivers. You have a quarterback that is more than capable of getting those guys the ball. You have Sam Laporta. You have Jahmyr Gibbs. You still have David Montgomery. You have one of the best offensive lines in football. There's a lot to like about this roster. And they build it from the trenches, pretty much inside to out. And that's how you're supposed to do it. So I don't want to take too much away from him. Like I said, he's an honorable mention for me. The biggest hesitation for me being in the top 10 is not taking process into account and how that's going to impact the Lions roster. Not this year, a couple years from now, when they're trying to stay in contention and trying to stay relevant within the NFC picture.
I think that's super fair. I think this year they did stay in that lane a little bit more. They added 2 corners early at a position of need. I'm not sure if corners in the premium position or if it's on the fringe. Some people argue about that. To me, it is. I think contractually, once and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, once Sauce and Surtain get paid, it'll probably be viewed as more premium because they'll move the market. But I don't know. When you take good football players and it works out, sure, it is bad process. But if they're able to get to the NFC Championship, almost win it with Jared Goff, and the team improves, I mean, if they make it to the Super Bowl next year, for me, it's hard to deny somebody of that. Obviously, it really depends on if you're a process over results person, which I think we all should be to an extent, but history books remember the results. And so I do have to take that into account. And granted, he's only been there for a short amount of time, but he's taken something that's been historically bad. This is what I talked about with Stefanski last week, really historically bad, and moved them up to the class of the NFC. And I think the guy that you have at 8 and that I have at 9 is he's not doing something similar, but I think that what he's been able to do with his team is certainly just as impressive given the amount of turnover at important positions, I'll say.
Yeah. So I think the big thing to point out with the guy that I have at 8 and the guy that you have at 9, Brian Gutekunst with the General Packer or the Green Bay Packers, trying to mix general managers in Green Bay is just not the thing to do. The guy that predated him was Ted Thompson. He was a guy that drafted a lot of homegrown guys. For those of you who are not aware, the Packers are actually owned by the fans. It's kind of like a board that oversees it. And so, again, they are a cheaper franchise. They aren't known to spend big because they don't have a billionaire backing them. That's just kind of how that team works. And that's cool. It's a really unique structure. They were the team that won the first 2 Super Bowls. They've won 2 more since with Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers. And what Ted Thompson did with Brett Favre is he drafted his replacement in Aaron Rodgers. Brian Gutekunst, when he comes onto the stage, when they're cleaning house, when he brings in Matt LaFleur, and I have Matt LaFleur at 2 because I have a lot of respect for kind of the schematic stuff that he's been able to do with the players. But what Gutekunst did, hey, we're going to draft our quarterback of the future. We're going to sit him behind a future Hall of Famer in Aaron Rodgers. And then, okay, we can't pay Davante Adams. We'll ship him out. We'll get draft picks. We'll start rebuilding this offense again. They've been known to have a solid offensive line. They've taken multiple defenders in the first round pick, and I think some of them have panned out. Guys like Jair Alexander, and I'm blanking out on some of the Rashawn Gary, and who's their other interior defensive lineman not named Devontae Wyatt. It's the guy that's been there a few years.
They took Kenny Clark like way back.
Yeah. And I don't know if he's responsible for that. He'd probably more be responsible for the extension. But when you look at just some of the investment and how they've gone about building the team, I think it's been very, very smart. And then, like, you look at that offensive room, like the guys they have in that wide receiver room, all on rookie contracts, that opens a 3-year window that you get to see who's really your superstars. You can extend those guys early. You can then go back to the draft and keep adding talent into those position groups, whether it's the offensive line, wide receiver, and probably still be able to pay Jordan Love like top quarterback money. And so I think when you look at just what he's been able to do with a limited budget in terms of like dealing with the whole Rodgers fiasco and then being able to not only trade Davante Adams for picks, but then trade Rodgers for picks and then use those picks as an influx of talent, I think it's just been phenomenal from top to bottom. I think that's why he's top 10 for me. And I'm a big fan that the Packers are going to make the Super Bowl from the NFC side this year. So I think if that's the case, he puts himself in a contention where he's top 5 because he's built a team that has been at the top of the NFC since they got there.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with everything you said. For me, one of the most important things that he has done during his tenure is navigate the whole Aaron Rodgers thing. This is kind of, we talked about it with like Brady coming available, Peyton Manning becoming available. This was kind of different. Rodgers really wasn't available because he was still on the team. Granted, it was clear that he wanted out. He went into the darkness realm or whatever it was, went into the dark hut for, was it 2 weeks? I don't even remember how long it was.
I thought it was just a couple of days. Like
maybe it was a couple of days.
Too long in complete darkness, you go blind. So I think it was just like a 2-3 day thing.
So he does that and he comes out of the little hut there and decides that I don't want to play for the Packers anymore. Trade me to the Jets. And he's like, all right, they worked out a deal there, but they had Jordan Love in place. He saw what happened with Rodgers and Brett Favre, and he had the guy in place. Granted, he had a while to simmer before we serve him out onto the field, but he really took off there. I like how he's brought in, a lot of these young weapons that you talked about. All these guys last year, like in terms of the receivers and tight ends, were either rookies or second-year players. And they've all really grown with Jordan Love. Like you said, they're going to be able to afford that Jordan Love extension when it comes down the pipeline, probably this offseason, I would imagine, if not next offseason, because he did the good deal with Love and signed him to that 2-year extension instead of the 5th year, so they have more control contractually when they want to extend Jordan Love over the next couple of off seasons. So that was good there. And then, like you said, a lot of even predating him, a lot of the first round picks were on defense, and while some were misses, a lot of them were hits, like you talked about. I think that's really important considering their defensive schematics last year weren't the best, but they have the talent on that side to where if the Boston College head coach that they bring in, I'm blanking on the name, if he's able to improve upon that end, they have the talent there. They have the quarterback on the offense if he continues to excel. Matt LaFleur is a great play caller, like you talked about. This should be a team that makes a run in the NFC. We saw what they were able to do to a team that we talked about earlier in the Cowboys in their stadium during the playoffs last year. So I think the sky's the limit for them. I have him at number 9, right below Brad Holmes, because I think Brad Holmes, number 1, dealt with a worse situation. And number 2, I do think that their team is a little bit better, just based on how they performed and the limited, let's say limited quarterback play, how much they were able to achieve because of that, but still neck and neck with Brad Holmes. And I do think both of these GMs and their teams will be making playoff runs this year. That's something we talked about last week.
Yeah, and the new defensive coordinator is Jeff Hafley. Like you said,
Okay.
he came from Boston College. And what I love is like, yes, like they've added so many offensive weapons, but it's not usually in the first round. So Rashawn Gary, first round pick in 19. Devontae Wyatt was a first round pick in 2022. Quay Walker was one in 2022. Eric Stokes was one in 2021. And then this past year, not this past year, but the year before, they added Lucas Van Ness. And I think when you have some of these edge rushing off and they're all kind of either on rookie contracts or homegrown talent that you've extended, like that's great. That's a place that if you are really like a player or two away going into next offseason, you could probably get a free agent to take a veteran deal, to take that pay cut to go play with a title contender. And I think that's what Gutekunst is putting in place. I think if he gets that Jordan Love contract done and he takes another step as a professional quarterback, I think the sky's the limit for this team. And so that's why he's as high as he is. He's navigated a lot of different waters with going from a Hall of Fame quarterback to an unproven guy and put out a contender time and time again. They just haven't gone over the hump. I've already talked about it before. Number 9, I have John Lynch, who you have at number 4. You talked about at 10 that you have Stephen Jones, not Jerry Jones, even though on paper it does say Jerry. The guy I have at 10 is a guy that I think is very controversial in terms of the Brad Holmes standpoint, where process is a little bit questionable, but the results are undeniable. And that's Nick Caserio with the Houston Texans. This is a guy that got the right quarterback, at least after year 1. We'll see if that's the case between CJ Stroud, Bryce Young as their careers kind of go on. But if CJ Stroud is the best quarterback from that draft class and Will Anderson continues to ascend, like you kind of project him to be what he's put out on tape so far, this is a team that's ascending from the young talent they have on their roster. This is a guy that got a lot of draft capital back from Deshaun Watson. I think he was the guy that drafted Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins and some of those guys. And so when you see just the talent that he's been able to add through the draft, what he's now done with this kind of championship window that's open for the Houston Texans because of his big gamble of trading back up to 3 last year, like it's paid off. This is a guy that surplus over expected in the draft. He ranks 5th. A lot of that is because of CJ Stroud and Will Anderson. When we look at kind of trades and just like the value he's added there, I don't think he's super high in terms of that. He is at 6, so he's not. Brian Gutekunst is at 5. Les Snead, we talked about earlier, he's at 4. So he's right outside of those top guys that we talk about when we're trading and getting value that way. So he's an excellent GM. He just makes some questionable things that makes you wonder, okay, if he continues with this bad process, is it going to eventually bite him in the butt? Is it going to be one of those things that a couple years down the road, you have CJ Stroud on this massive quarterback contract and you go in on this big trade or this big, like kind of 180 thing, like a lot hinges on this and it doesn't work out in your favor? Is that going to cause you to get canned or people to question kind of your process and ideology? So like you said, results are what goes in the history books. And right now the results have proven him right and his process right. I think from a overall analytics standpoint, though, there's a lot to dislike about him, and that's why he's at number 10 for me.
Yeah, for sure, right? And the questionable process in question, no pun intended, was the Will Anderson trade, right? During the draft, obviously they had Stroud at 2. I think their other pick was 12, if I recall
Yep.
correctly.
They
They
had that one from
trade
the Browns.
right
Yeah.
from the Watson deal. They trade up to 3 to get Will Anderson. Obviously, phenomenal rookie year, defensive rookie of the year alongside Stroud, who won offensive rookie of the year. But like you said, if they try to make that move again, let's say for a receiver in the future, and it doesn't work out, then yeah, you might get canned for that. But I really like what he's been able to do. Number one, I don't want to say navigate the Watson scenario because it's really odd to talk about on that one. But from picking up from what the team was after that, with the who was the QB following? It was the guy that drafted Davis Mills.
Davis Mills. Yep.
With Davis Mills, he was a quarterback, but then they get Stroud, they get Will Anderson. They add a lot of young receivers. Nico Collins takes a step, they get tanked out. And they had one old receiver this offseason and Stephon Diggs. And while he was a bit disgruntled in Buffalo, they ended up trading a second for him, which they got by trading back out of the first round using some of the extra draft capital they had. I believe they own the Vikings second this upcoming year. Or was that the one they no? Which one did they
No, they
send
got
to
the one this past year that I
this
believe they sent
past
to
year? Okay.
Buffalo. Yeah.
Uh, Either way, I think that was a good process there. They're able to
Yeah.
add Diggs, even if Diggs isn't who we
But okay,
saw.
let's talk about the Diggs contract because you brought
All
up the
right,
Will Anderson. They cut his contract down to where it's
right.
a 1-year deal. It's a 1-year deal.
And that's what I was going to say. Even if he's not the Diggs that we saw in the first half of the season, if he's second half Diggs, he's only on the hook for 1 year, right? And they can always replace him in the draft in the first round if they need to. They can
But
always go out.
you traded a second for Diggs. That's more the
Right. That's
point. It's like you're
well, I'm saying I'm just looking at it from a good perspective because he can come in and be the receiver too, because Nico Collins has taken a huge step. Even if this is shaky and Diggs is still disgruntled, I think it's a win for a young quarterback in Stroud who, despite him being so good, we got to remember he's going into year 2, right? Like this isn't a seasoned veteran by any means, despite his play. So I think surrounding your young quarterback with good infrastructure, well, I say good players, maybe Diggs might not be the best infrastructure. You get some guys on defense and Will Anderson, Derek Stingley's really coming along now. He was a ball hawk when he played last year. So I
Danielle
think
Hunter, I thought was a great
Danielle
addition.
Hunter,
Yeah.
that was an excellent addition. What was it, 48
It's
over
48 fully
2 and
guaranteed.
get
Yeah.
fully guaranteed, which I think is fine for him. I think he's making all the right moves. The O line they've invested a ton into. They had a lot of injuries last year, but the O line was still stout. And then still keeping Bobby Slowick for another year. I think a lot of these things are really good for a young quarterback. And he didn't make number 10 for me. That's where Stephen Jones is. He is an honorable mention for me. And a couple more honorable mentions, excuse me, for me. Omar Khan with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah with the Minnesota Vikings. We talked about Caserio. Eric DaCosta, I think, has done a really good job in Baltimore following Ozzie Newsome. And then I put Astroseas next to this guy, Mickey Loomis. We don't think of him as a great GM, but they're like 90 in the hole every year, and he's always able to make it work somehow. Even if they only lose one piece, they float above water somehow. So I had to keep him there. Maybe it's because his last name's Loomis, and that's where they're getting a little bit of extra money, but who knows?
Yeah, I don't know what the deal is with Mickey Loomis. He's obviously a magician in some regards and how he's able to restructure things and keep kicking the can down the line. And you always think it's going to bite him in the butt. But I've talked about this on this podcast that like if somehow he hits on the next late round quarterback in Spencer Rattler, and they have this young offensive coordinator in Clint Kubiak that kind of sticks around for the next couple of years, it could change the trajectory. It could be very much like the 2017 draft where these couple of rookies that are coming in kind of pave the way for you to kind of give yourself some exit lanes on these contracts and not feel like you have to keep guys or keep pushing that can down the road. So we'll see how that goes with that. My honorable mentions, I already talked about Brad Holmes. Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah with the Vikings. I think he's done some smart things. Jason Fitzgerald kind of hung him out the dry based on what he did in this past year's draft. And it was 2 trade ups in essence. He trades up for JJ McCarthy from their pick 11 to go up to pick 10. The Jets probably weren't going to take him there, but I wonder if there was another offer on the table that the Jets were considering and the Vikings just wanted to lock in their quarterback. The other was they trade up with the Texans, and then they trade up again to go get arguably the best edge in Dallas Turner. And I think at pick 18, Dallas Turner's fine. It's just one of those questions where if he doesn't produce like a top edge rusher, like a Will Anderson, the value is lost there because of what you've given up to go get these guys. And so now you're banking on the fact that you need these rookies to perform similarly to what CJ Stroud and Will Anderson did this past year. And it's definitely possible, especially with the infrastructure they have on offense, the coaching staff that they have. I think it's there, but it's got to come together for me to think that Kwesi not only has good process in some circumstances, but his evaluations are also correct, because that's part of the job. You can't just have good process. That's Scott Fitter and Joe Douglas. They've done plenty of good process, taking a quarterback high with a pick, taking some premium positions earlier on, and it hasn't panned out for them because, one, they haven't put the right coaches in place, and one, they haven't been married with some of the contract negotiations. I mean, we just saw with Joe Douglas the issues with letting Bryce Huff walk in free agency and then trade for Hassan Reddick, who wants a new contract still, and you're not willing to hand it out. And so you have this whole bunch of disgruntlement with Scott Fitter. We saw it with the Brian Burns situation getting drug out. And we saw how quickly Dan Morgan got Derek Brown extended. And it's some of those things where it's just like, you can be spot on with, okay, we're doing it this way. But if you don't evaluate players correctly, you aren't actually hitting on those guys, then it doesn't really matter. So that's why I think Kwesi is kind of in that honorable mention section for both of us. And then another guy that we haven't talked about, but I think he deserves some credit, is Omar Khan with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's been there the past 3 years. Every offseason, it feels like he's adding new pieces to the offensive line to try to build that. I am a little bit concerned about the wide receiver room, but the defense is one of the best. They have superstars kind of at all 3 levels, in my opinion, on that defense. And adding guys like Joey Porter and Alex Highsmith over the past couple of years have paid dividends. So I think that's a guy to kind of keep a lookout, that if they're able to make something work with Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, or they're able to find a long-term quarterback, I think he'll be a name to watch approaching the top 10 in the next couple of years. So with that, we are into Purrfect Takes. You want to kick this section off and then I'll kind of wrap up?
Yeah, for sure. Mine's a bit more conceptual this time, more than a hot take. You had talked about how Brett Veach helped negotiate the Patrick Mahomes mega deal. I think it was at the time $450 million over 10 years. Obviously, they've amended it, and they'll continue to do so to keep him among the top 3 or 5 QBs in the league. But the guy who was mainly responsible for it was their cap czar at the time, who's now in the Carolina Panthers, Brant Tillis. And my take is that he is going to be the biggest addition to the Panthers organization this year. I think we're already starting to see the returns on that. The Derek Brown contract I thought was pretty good. Well, granted, nothing's really happened with Deontay Johnson yet. It wouldn't surprise me if he's extended on a more friendly deal. We see the wide receiver market blow up, and I wonder if he's going to be closer to a Judy extension rather than like a God forbid, like a AJ Brown or an extension like that. But I think having a guy who knows his stuff, if you watch the Panthers blueprint shorts, he seems very, very knowledgeable, not only about the cap stuff, but a scouting perspective as well. I think he's going to be paramount to the Panthers front office this season.
I like it. Brant Tillis, we saw him get signed. He's had those clips on Blueprint, like you said, been instrumental in some of the key signings we've had that I feel are very much married to how the coaching staff views the team and adding kind of the right players, even though they may not be the most talented. Because I don't think necessarily the edge group that we have, any of them are more talented than Brian Burns, but fitting an Evero's scheme, doing what we need to do on defense to keep offenses contained. I think we're smart. And as long as guys stay healthy, we're going to see those contributions early and often, because we're going to have to rely on the defensive side and some of these other pieces to work as the offense is kind of gelling and figuring things out with a new coaching staff and some new players. So I think Brant Tillis is going to be a huge needle mover. We'll see if he's more valuable than a Dave Canales or Dan Morgan. I'm sure those guys will get a lot more roses because they're the top guys. Brant Tillis is more a guy that either more Panther fans are going to know or more people that are inclined to analytics would recognize. The hot take or perfect take that I have is I think Chris Ballard kind of starts making a name for himself. And obviously he's not doing it because he's not playing, but the roster he's constructed for the Indianapolis Colts, I think this team has what it takes to make the divisional round this year. And I think they'll make a splash. They'll win a playoff game. They'll be that surprise AFC team, and they'll look really, really good. Anthony Richardson will be healthy. Shane Steichen will do his thing. And they haven't won a playoff game since 2018. So this would be huge for them, taking a step in the right direction in terms of kind of this rebuild that's happened over the past couple of years. So that's kind of my take on a underrated general manager kind of stating his claim as being one of the best in the NFL. I think with that, we are about wrapped up on this episode. And this concludes kind of this mini series that we had leading up to our main content. So this will mark pretty much in essence the 1 year anniversary for Purrfect Takes will be next week, because it puts us at kind of the 9 weeks before the season. So we'll do a division by division breakdown, and we'll have a guest for every single podcast. We'll have Bruce Nolan from kind of Bills Mafia, Bills Twitter, really, really great guy, good content that he puts out. We have Colin Dunphy returning again for the NFC East. Then we'll go into the NFC, AFC North. We have some cool people there in the analytics field with Anthony Reinhard and Tej Seth. And it just keeps going. So hopefully we'll have a guest list out for you guys, but we're going to be breaking down these divisions, these teams, our expectations for them, and try to build this kind of like general framework of how we should be viewing the NFL teams going into 2024 and what those expectations should be. And obviously things can happen. I don't think any of us saw the Texans being as good as they were this past year, and there's always going to be those surprises, but we'll try to capture that with some of the ceilings and floors that we do when we look at these teams. Is there any point you want to make about this series that's kicking off?
I just want to say it was cool to rank different positions and I guess positions within teams and coaching and front offices and stuff like that. But I'm really excited to start going over the divisions, because that's when we actually get into the football of it, you know?
Yeah, no, and it's going to be a lot of fun conversations. Like I said, the guest list is very extensive. We're going to have some fun conversations and debates. So stay tuned. You'll find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. We're going to be posting more on Twitter. So just keep an eye out on that. Hit us with a follow, like, subscribe, and we'll catch you guys next week.